Have you ever walked alone at night near train tracks and felt that inexplicable sensation that something is watching you from the shadows? Have you heard that metallic, raspy sound that seems to follow you, as if something is dragging itself across the ground behind you? Tonight I'm going to tell you the most disturbing story from Japan, an urban legend that has terrorized entire generations and continues claiming victims to this day. This is about TEKE TEKE, the mutilated spirit of a young woman who lost half her body in the most brutal train accident you can imagine, and who now seeks revenge by dragging herself with her own hands along the railway tracks, emitting that characteristic sound that gives her name. TEKE TEKE, TEKE TEKE. But this isn't just any horror story, it's a warning. Because according to legend, if you hear her complete story, TEKE TEKE will come for you in exactly 30 days. And when she does, she'll cut you in half, just as happened to her. Before we dive into this chilling story that could change the way you see train tracks forever, I need to ask you for a very important favor. If this type of content fascinates you as much as it does me, please subscribe to the channel and leave your like, because this helps me enormously to continue bringing you the most disturbing urban legends and the most shocking paranormal cases from around the world. Your support means everything to me and allows me to dedicate hours of research to bring you stories that will keep you awake at night. The story of TEKE TEKE began on a cold winter night in Hokkaido, Japan, when a young high school student named Kashima Reiko was heading home after a long day of classes. She was known for being an exemplary student, always responsible, always punctual. But that night, something terrible was about to change her destiny forever. While walking across the train bridge that crossed over a deep ravine, a group of older students intercepted her. These young people, known for their problematic behavior, had been drinking and were looking for fun at others' expense. What began as a cruel prank quickly turned into something much more sinister. The students surrounded Kashima, mocking her, pushing her toward the train rails. She begged them to leave her alone, but her screams only seemed to amuse her tormentors more. At that critical moment, when Kashima was desperately trying to escape from her torturers, she heard the distant whistle of the night train approaching at full speed. Panic seized her as she tried to get away from the tracks, but in her desperation, she stumbled and fell directly onto the metal rails. The students, horrified by what they had caused, stood paralyzed as the train's lights approached closer and closer. Kashima tried to get up, but her legs had become trapped between the rails. The train conductor, seeing the figure on the tracks, applied the emergency brakes, but it was too late. The train struck the young woman's body with devastating force, cutting her cleanly in half at the waist. Her upper torso was thrown several meters away from the tracks, while her legs were crushed under the heavy train wheels. The witnesses would never forget the heartbreaking screams heard that night, nor the image of Kashima dragging herself with her hands before dying from blood loss. After learning these disturbing details, I wonder if you've ever experienced something paranormal near train tracks or abandoned places. Tell me in the comments what your most terrifying experience has been, because these stories always have a background of real experiences that people have lived through. But Kashima Reiko's death was not the end of her story, but merely the beginning of a nightmare that would extend for decades. The first reports of strange apparitions began just 1 week after the accident. railway workers working night shifts began reporting sightings of a female figure dragging herself along the tracks, using only her arms. They described the distinctive sound she made while moving. "Teke teke, teke teke," as if something metallic was being dragged against the steel of the rails. At first, these reports were dismissed as hallucinations or products of collective guilt over the tragic accident, but soon the sightings became more frequent and more detailed. Witnesses described a young woman in a torn and blood-stained school uniform, with long, disheveled hair partially covering her face, disfigured by anger and pain. But most disturbing was the speed with which she moved, dragging herself with her, arms at supernatural speed, as if death had granted her impossible strength and agility for a human being. The first confirmed victims of Teke Teke appeared a month after the initial accident. A railway worker named Tanaka Hiroshi was found dead on the tracks, with his body cut cleanly in half, exactly the same way Kashima had died. The strange thing was that there were no signs that a train had passed through that section of tracks during the night, and the wounds seemed too precise to have been caused by heavy machinery. Investigators were baffled, especially when it was discovered that Tanaka had called his wife just an hour before his death, whispering over the phone that something was following him on the tracks and that he could hear a strange sound. Teke teke, teke teke. The recording of that call, according to those who heard it, contained that same metallic and raspy sound in the background, followed by Tanaka's desperate screams before the line was abruptly cut. During the following months, more people began to disappear or appear dead under similar circumstances, all cut in half, all found near train tracks. What made these cases even more disturbing was the pattern that began to emerge. All the victims had reported hearing the story of Teke Teke exactly 30 days before their death. Some had heard the story from friends, others had read it in local newspapers, but all had been exposed to the specific details of the legend before becoming victims. This pattern led many to believe that simply knowing Teke Teke's story was enough to be marked as her next victim. Now, I want to pause to ask you something important. Do you think urban legends have any foundation in reality? Or do you think they are simply products of our collective imagination? Leave your opinion in the comments, because this is a question that has fascinated paranormal researchers for decades. The physical description of Teke Teke, according to numerous witnesses who managed to survive their encounters, is truly terrifying. She appears as a young woman of approximately 18 years old, wearing the torn remains of a Japanese school uniform. Her white blouse is completely soaked in dried blood, and her pleated skirt hangs in tatters around what remains of her torso. Her long black hair falls over her face in a way that partially hides her eyes, but those who have managed to see them describe them as completely black, with no visible iris or pupil, as if they were two empty holes filled with pure hatred. Her skin has a greyish tone, like that of a corpse that has been underwater for weeks, and is covered with open wounds that never heal. But most disturbing of all is the way she moves. She propels herself forward using only her arms, which have developed supernatural strength, allowing her to move at impossible speeds, up to 150 kilometers per hour, according to some testimonies. The sound she produces while moving, that characteristic Teke Teke that gives her name, comes from the friction of the exposed bones of her pelvis and spine against hard surfaces like asphalt, concrete, and especially the metal of train tracks. Survivors describe this sound as something that embeds itself in your mind, a metallic and raspy noise accompanied by a guttural moan of pain and fury that seems to resonate from beyond the grave. Many have compared this sound to the screech of rusted metal being dragged over rails, but with an organic component that makes it infinitely more disturbing. Once you hear this sound, according to legends, it's already too late to escape. Teke. Teke's hunting methods are particularly cruel and systematic. According to testimonies collected over the years, she doesn't attack randomly, but follows specific patterns that reflect the meticulous nature she had in life as an exemplary student. First, she identifies her potential victims, generally people who have heard her story or who frequent areas near train tracks during nighttime hours. Then she begins a stalking period that can last up to 30 days, during which the victim reports increasingly intense experiences, shadows moving in their peripheral vision, the tek tek sound heard in the distance, recurring nightmares about trains and accidents, and a constant sensation of being watched. During this stalking period, Teke gradually increases her presence in the victim's life. She begins appearing in places where the victim feels safe, their own home, their workplace, even in dreams. Testimonies speak of victims who report seeing her reflection in windows during the night, always with that mutilated figure dragging herself behind them. Others speak of phone calls where only that characteristic metallic sound is heard, or of finding bloody handprints on their windows in the mornings. The psychological tension during this period is so intense that many victims develop severe insomnia, paranoia, and panic attacks, which makes them even more vulnerable when Teke Teke finally decides to attack. I ask you now, and I really want you to reflect on this. What would you do if you started experiencing these signs after hearing this story? Would you try to rationalize the experiences or take preventive measures? Share your strategy in the comments. Teke Teke's final attack always occurs when the victim is alone and vulnerable, generally during the darkest hours of the night, between 2 and 4 in the morning. Survivors describe the moment of encounter as something that defies all logic and reason. Teke Teke appears suddenly, regardless of physical barriers like closed doors or windows, as if the limitations of the physical world don't apply to her. She moves with supernatural speed, creating that characteristic sound that intensifies until it becomes a deafening roar. Her arms, strengthened by decades of dragging her mutilated body, are capable of breaking through solid wood doors and bending metal bars as if they were wire. When Teke Teke reaches her victim, the method of death is always the same. Using her hands, which have developed claws as sharp as razors, she cuts the person exactly in half at the waist, precisely replicating the wounds she herself suffered in the train accident. But most disturbing is that this process is not instantaneous. The few testimonies from people who managed to escape at the last moment describe how Teke Teke deliberately prolongs the suffering, as if she wanted her victims to experience the same terror and pain she felt during her last moments of life. She speaks to her victims during the attack, whispering questions like, "Where are my legs?" or "Do you want to be like me?" and demands specific answers that, according to legend, could be the only way to survive the encounter. Japanese authorities have officially documented more than 200 deaths that match exactly with Teke Teke's modus. operandi over the last 50 years. Although officially these cases are classified as unsolved homicides or industrial accidents, private investigators who have studied these cases have identified patterns that are impossible to explain through conventional means: the precision of the wounds, the absence of cutting tools at crime scenes, and the fact that many victims were found in places completely inaccessible to vehicles or heavy machinery, have led many experts to consider supernatural explanations. Most recent cases include that of Yamamoto Kenji in 2019, a 34-year-old engineer who worked in railway maintenance in Osaka. Kenji had heard Teke Teke's story from an older colleague exactly 30 days before his death. During those 4 weeks, he meticulously documented in his personal diary the paranormal experiences he began to have. Shadows moving in his house, the teke teke sound heard during his night shifts, and recurring nightmares about a mutilated woman chasing him. His last diary entry, written just hours before his death, simply said, "She is here. I can hear her dragging herself down the hallway. The sound is exactly as they described. I don't think I can escape this time." Kenji's body was found the next morning in his apartment, cut cleanly in half. What made this case particularly disturbing was that his apartment was on the 5th floor of a building, with all doors and windows locked from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry, no traces of cutting tools, and neighbors reported hearing only that raspy metallic sound during the night, followed by screams that were abruptly cut off. I would like to know your opinion about something. Do you think it's possible that these deaths have a rational explanation that we simply haven't discovered yet? Or do you think some things go beyond our current scientific understanding? This is a question that fascinates me, and I would love to read your thoughts in the comments. Attempts at protection against Teke Teke have evolved over the years, becoming a complex series of rituals and precautions that Japanese communities have developed to try to avoid becoming victims of this vengeful spirit. According to the oldest oral traditions, there are certain specific responses that can be given to Teke Teke when she asks her characteristic questions during an encounter. When she asks, "Where are my legs?" the correct answer supposedly is, "They are on the Meishin train," referring to a specific train line in Japan. If she asks, "Who told you?" the answer should be, "Kashima-san told me," using her real name. However, these protection methods are inconsistent, and many victims who knew the correct answers still ended up being killed. Other protection methods include carrying specific amulets like Buddhist protection talismans, completely avoiding areas near train tracks during nighttime hours, and never listening to or telling Teke Teke's complete story. Some families have developed elaborate rituals that include purifying their homes with sea salt and incense, installing bells at all entrances to detect supernatural presence, and keeping lights on throughout the night. However, the effectiveness of these measures is questionable, as Teke Teke seems capable of overcoming most physical and spiritual barriers. Modern paranormal investigators have proposed more sophisticated theories about Teke Teke's nature and possible protection methods. Some suggest that she is a specific type of vengeful spirit known as onryo in Japanese tradition, fed by intense emotions of anger, pain, and thirst for revenge. According to this theory, Teke Teke cannot find peace until she has balanced universal karma by cutting in half the same number of people who witnessed or contributed to her original death. This would explain why she continues hunting victims after so many decades. The spread of Teke Teke's legend in the digital age has added new dimensions to this paranormal phenomenon. With the advent of the internet and social media, the story has reached global audiences, and reports of encounters with Teke Teke have begun appearing in countries outside Japan, especially in urban areas with extensive railway systems. Documented cases in South Korea, Taiwan, and more recently in cities like New York and London suggest that Teke Teke may have evolved beyond her original geographical origins. Videos and audio recordings that supposedly capture encounters with Teke Teke have circulated widely on digital platforms, although the authenticity of these materials is highly disputed. However, some of these videos contain elements that are extremely difficult to fake, including the characteristic Teke Teke sound recorded under circumstances where there were no obvious mechanical sources to produce that specific noise. Forensic audio analyses of these recordings have revealed infrasonic frequencies that are known to cause sensations of fear and anxiety in humans, which could explain why hearing these sounds produces such visceral reactions. Here, I have a very specific question for you. Have you ever heard inexplicable sounds during the night that have caused you instinctive terror without knowing exactly why? These types of auditory experiences are more common than people admit, and I would love to know your stories. The psychological effects of Teke Teke's legend transcend simple fear of a supernatural encounter. Psychologists who have studied this phenomenon have identified what they call Teke Teke syndrome, a condition that affects people who have been exposed to the story and develop symptoms of severe anxiety, insomnia, and obsessive-compulsive behaviors related to avoiding tracks and similar spaces. Symptoms include recurring nightmares about trains and mutilation, constant hypervigilance, especially during nighttime hours, and an obsessive concern about metallic sounds that could be interpreted as the characteristic Teke Teke. The most severe cases of Teke Teke syndrome have resulted in psychiatric hospitalizations and, in some extreme cases, suicide attempts by people who preferred to take their own lives, rather than face a possible encounter with the vengeful spirit. These cases have led some Japanese psychiatrists to recommend that Teke Teke's story be classified as potentially harmful material for mental health, similar to how other types of traumatic content are treated. However, other experts argue that Teke Teke syndrome may actually be a manifestation of real encounters with supernatural entities, and that the psychological symptoms are the result of exposure to genuine paranormal energies. They point out that symptom patterns are remarkably consistent among victims who have had no contact with each other, and that many of the symptoms, such as the ability to detect infrasonic frequencies, could be evolutionary adaptations to the presence of supernatural threats. The scientific community remains divided on the Teke Teke phenomenon. Skeptics argue that all cases can be explained through a combination of collective hysteria, homicides committed by imitators, and the human tendency to find supernatural patterns in tragic but coincidental events. They point out that many of the evidence has been discredited or can be explained through conventional means, and that the viral nature of urban legends in the digital age has enormously amplified both false reports and collective anxiety. The other hand, paranormal researchers present evidence they consider impossible to explain through conventional means. This includes audio and video recordings that have passed rigorous forensic analysis, testimonies from multiple independent witnesses describing identical encounters without having had previous contact, and the supernatural precision of wounds found in victims. They also point out that the consistency of reports across different cultures and time periods suggests the existence of a real phenomenon beyond simple urban mythology. Let me ask you something that really intrigues me. After hearing all these details about Teke Teke, do you feel different walking alone at night, especially near train tracks? Sometimes I wonder if simple knowledge of these stories fundamentally changes our perception of the world around us. The most recent and best documented cases of encounters with Teke Teke have occurred in the era of omnipresent digital surveillance, which has provided new types of evidence that are harder to dismiss. In 2021, a security camera system at Shibuya train station captured what appears to be a female figure moving at supernatural speed through the platforms during the early morning hours. The figure suddenly appears in the frame, moves in a manner consistent with descriptions of Teke Teke, dragging herself with her arms at impossible speed, and then disappears just as suddenly. Technical analyses of the recording have found no signs of digital manipulation, and the captured movements are biomechanically impossible for a normal human being. Another notable case occurred in 2022, when multiple car dashcams simultaneously captured a figure crossing an elevated road over railway tracks in Kyoto. The videos, taken from different angles by drivers who didn't know each other, show the same mutilated figure moving at approximately 100 kilometers per hour. What makes this case particularly convincing is that the audio from the videos clearly captures the tek tek sound, and several drivers immediately called police to report what they had witnessed. The official investigation concluded that there was no conventional explanation for the captured images. Scientific attempts to study the Teke Teke phenomenon have faced unique challenges, primarily because encounters seem to occur only under specific conditions that are difficult to replicate in controlled environments. However, some researchers have managed to document electromagnetic anomalies in areas where frequent sightings have occurred. These include fluctuations in local magnetic fields, interference with electronic equipment, and the presence of infrasonic frequencies that match audio recordings from supposed encounters with Teke Teke. Dr. Hiroshi Nakamura, a physicist from the University of Tokyo who has dedicated the last 10 years to studying Japanese paranormal phenomena, has proposed what he calls the traumatic resonance theory. According to this theory, extreme traumatic events can create persistent impressions in the local quantum field that manifest as observable paranormal phenomena. In Teke Teke's case, he suggests that the extreme trauma of her violent death, combined with the intense emotional energy of vengeance and pain, has created a semi-permanent quantum entity that can interact with our physical world under certain conditions. This theory, although controversial, has gained some support within the alternative scientific community, especially after controlled experiments managed to detect measurable quantum anomalies at sites where traumatic deaths occurred. Critics argue that these results can be explained by conventional environmental factors, but the data continues accumulating in ways that are difficult to ignore. I want to ask you a final question before concluding this story. Do you think science will eventually be able to completely explain phenomena like Teke Teke, Or are there aspects of human experience that will always remain beyond our rational understanding? Your perspective on this really interests me. The question that remains unanswered, and will probably remain unanswered for a long time, is whether Teke Teke represents a genuine paranormal phenomenon, or if she is the product of an extraordinarily complex combination of psychological, sociological factors and statistical coincidences. What cannot be denied is the profound and lasting impact this legend has had on Japanese culture, and increasingly on global culture. It has changed the way people perceive train tracks, has influenced the development of new horror genres, and has created an international community of researchers dedicated to understanding its mysteries. If this story has impacted you as much as it did me when I first heard it, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Have you had any inexplicable experience near train tracks? Do you think urban legends like this have any foundation in reality? And the most important question of all, after hearing this complete story about Teke Teke, do you feel prepared to face what may come in the next 30 days? According to legend, the simple fact of knowing all these details has already marked you as her next potential victim. But maybe, just maybe, knowledge is also power. And being prepared is the only real defense against the unknown. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you want more stories like this. Give it a like if it has kept you in suspense during these minutes, and above all, stay safe during the next few weeks. Because you never know when you might hear that characteristic sound in the darkness. Teke Teke, Teke Teke, getting closer and closer.